there's been another House of the Dragon teaser trailer, and you know what that means. I'm going to dissect it in a level of detail that is very, very likely to be overkill and probably inappropriate for the amount of information actually presented in a 1 minute 43-second trailer that includes a 10-second ad at the end to quote-unquote choose your plan on HBO Max. Here's my plan. I'm going to go through this frame by frame like a very normal person and then probably borrow an account. I'm just kidding about that part. I love you, HBO. Please don't come after me. And to start this breakdown off, we're going to go through with a factual recap of what happened in this trailer in as little time as possible. Last time I put a time limit on myself before recording and then missed it by a little bit, putting dragon egg on my face, I guess. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to say after the sentence how long it took me after editing to recap this trailer and dub that in seamlessly so you don't notice. Here we go. Let's put 16 hours, 43 minutes and 8 seconds. Oh God, what happened? I blacked out and there's 16 hours of footage. I heard the strange sound of piping music and a violin in the distance. Something just keeps singing. Hey do, Mary do, ring-a-dong dillo, ring-a-dong hop along, fall all the willow. Just over and over and over again. And they're screaming about Goldberry. Where is she? There's something at the door. It's scratching furiously. Oh, God, please send help. On the clock and see if I can beat that. We see Rhaenyra Targaryen looking very focused, overlooking a body of water wearing Jon Snow's cloak. King Viserys narrates over the footage saying,
"What is this brief mortal life, if not the pursuit of legacy?"
Big Daddy Daemon walks out of Dragonstone holding a dragon egg, flanked by his gold cloaks and Mysaria, his white worm. They appear to be confronted by Otto Hightower, 2 Knights of the Kingsguard, and a maester. We see a tan or yellowish dragon flying into the Red Keep with a rider with long silvery hair, most likely Rhaenyra, but possibly Daemon. All the lords of Westeros swear to Princess Rhaenyra, starting with Rickon or Rickard Stark, Corlys Velaryon, and Borman Baratheon. They say the words,
I, Rickon Stark.
I, Corlys Velaryon.
I, Borman Baratheon.
Promise to be faithful to King Viserys and to his named heir,
Princess Rhaenyra.
Rhaenyra Targaryen.
Princess Rhaenyra turns around and looks very satisfied to be the next monarch. About that. Prince Daemon, though, looks very furious at something, and he's wearing his gold cloak and hanging out with his gold boys again. They all start cheering and charge through a gate probably in King's Landing. Rhaenys Targaryen says this line,
"Men would sooner put the realm to the torch than see a woman ascend the Iron Throne."
While in the background, the gold cloaks are beating the crap out of some random people as they do. Cuts to Rhaenys, who is speaking to Rhaenyra in a courtyard of some kind. Next, we see Rhaenyra standing over a painted table on Dragonstone, Aegon's famous map of Westeros, and definitely not a tabletop game board. Holy shit, that would be sweet. Then we see what appears to be the burnt out ruins of Harrenhal with hundreds of people inside, very likely to be the Great Council of 101. Walking through the lords is 2 men carrying a box of some kind, possibly carrying votes. Cut to the younger Alicent Hightower walking through the Great Hall of the Red Keep alone. She walks up to King Viserys and plants a kiss on his cheek. The camera pans and we see that dragon egg from earlier sitting on a smoldering brazier. Otto Hightower picks up narration saying,
We play an ugly game. You have the determination to win it.
Meanwhile, he speaks with his daughter Alicent, who is looking worried in front of a fireplace. I wonder why. We see a repeat from the last trailer with the Velaryon house walking down some steps to that feast. Then a surprise. We see a younger Daemon Targaryen with much shorter hair smirking at something at a feast next to Lord Lionel Strong, former Hand of the King. How Strong made into the trailer. Get hype. Later, Velaryon and young Rhaenyra do some kind of strange back-to-back dance, mayhaps. The Dance of the Dragons. Roll credits. The crowd in the Great Hall then all cheer quite lustily. Whoops! Cut to a Velaryon funeral where a stone-carved casket is being pushed into Davy Jones' locker. Based on the hair and figure of the carving, I'm guessing this is Laenor Velaryon's casket, not Laenor's. Unless Laenor has the hips for the boys. Older Rhaenyra and Alicent then try to kill each other with mean glares on Driftmark. Suddenly a young man with short silvery hair is thrown to the ground by two Kingsguard. A Kingsguard is then beating up someone with their fists, with blood flying through the air and onto their armor. Blood continues to flow as two hands are clasped tightly with blood leaking between them. We see it's actually Daemon and Rhaenyra smiling at each other while she wears a strange looking hat or veil of some kind. We see Otto Hightower again looking very concerned, still flanked by Kingsguard. Daemon is back on Dragonstone with his gold boys, pulls out Dark Sister while still cradling that egg. More blade action as Alicent tries to stab Rhaenyra with that dagger, continuing the scene from the previous teaser. Rhaenyra though catches Alicent's arm to stop the stabbing. Narration picks up with,
History does not remember blood, it remembers names.
And Daemon continues his spelunking adventure, revealed to be in a cave system. He looks up shocked to see an angry dragon roaring and breathing fire into the air. And then some ads from HBO Max and a recommendation to watch their playlist of other trailers, 133 of them. Wow, that is definitely not getting a click. All right, well done me. Nailed that list of events in a trailer. So with that out of the way, let's talk about piecing together these scenes into possible narratives and explain what's going on with them. Before I get going though, there will be heavy spoilers for House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood. There's no guarantee the show sticks to specific details and plots from the books, so watch at your own risk. There's about 10 sequences within this teaser with shots that are connected in some way, some obviously so and some less. The first one, and the most featured in the teaser, is Daemon's spelunking adventure for what seems to be a dragon egg. It's a little tricky to piece together because it's out of order, but here's what I think happens. Daemon goes into a cave system underneath Dragonstone looking for a dragon egg. We know this by the angry fire-breathing dragon which lives in the dormant volcano called the Dragonmont. Second, because of the carved pillars flanking the beast. It could possibly be Daemon's own dragon Tagirijus, but I would be skeptical because this dragon is very, very, very angry at Daemon and he looks particularly scared. There are numerous dragons on Dragonstone at this time, so with the low lighting it's kind of tough to guess which one this is. The color of its scales is relatively washed out by the flame. The relatively small size might indicate one of the wild dragons in possibly Sheepstealer or the Grey Ghost. Whichever it is, that dragon is really not happy to see the rogue prince. We can surmise that he's stealing one of the dragon eggs and got caught in the act like the dirty egg thief that he is. The other hint of the scene is what comes next. Daemon walking out of the Dragonstone castle gates with a dragon egg in his arm, and specifically Mysaria walking with him. This is kind of one of those non-obvious things that you might not get if you hadn't read Fire and Blood ahead of time. We are told in Fire and Blood that one of the things that really pissed off his brother Viserys was that Daemon, while living on Dragonstone, stole a dragon egg and gave it to Mysaria. The reason Daemon did that is that Mysaria isn't just his mistress of whispers. She was also his lover and, I guess, paramour, while he ignored his lady wife, Rhea Royce. Daemon had put a bun in Mysaria's oven, and he planned to give his firstborn child a dragon egg to hatch. Viserys was understandably furious about this and ordered Daemon to return the egg. And that all kind of lines up with what we see in the teaser. Daemon goes and gets an egg, he's walking out of the castle holding it with Mysaria, and then standing in the way is an incredulous Hand of the King Otto Hightower in armor with at least two members of the Kingsguard. It seems quite plausible that they are there to enforce Viserys' decree that Daemon has to return the egg to the Dragon Keepers. Of course, Daemon being Daemon, he refuses and draws Dark Sister instead, threatening the king's party with violence. Although we do know that Daemon does eventually give in and he does hand the egg back over, it's quite possibly the very same one that we see in the brazier next to King Viserys in this shot. Why this matters at all, other than being some weird historical footnote, is because the whole egg drama is one of the key moments when the relationship between King Viserys and his brother fractures hard. Not just because Viserys ordered Daemon to give up the egg, but he also orders Daemon to send Mysaria back home to Lys and return to his abandoned wife Rhea Royce, whom Daemon hates and possibly later kills. During Mysaria's trip back to Lys though, the ship ran into a storm and she miscarried the child. Obviously, Daemon was a teensy bit upset about that and held a grudge against his brother for quite a long while. Daemon spent the next several years butchering pirates with sword and dragon flame just to try and get over the pain he felt at the loss and his anger at Viserys, whom he could not take it out on. This is a primary motivator that led to Daemon leaving King's Landing and crowning himself King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea after waging war against the pirates there to have his own kingdom apart from Viserys. Get ready for that plot when it shows up in the show. It's a fairly key one that colors much of their relationship. But the show may have added a bit of a twist to it as well. We see in the teaser that Otto Hightower is personally leading the force against Daemon, and in armor, no less. This is perhaps a hint of how Alicent actually ends up marrying King Viserys. It's an open secret that Otto very likely bought his spot continuing his hand to the king for Viserys by swinging the vote for him at the Great Council of 101, and that it's very likely a part of that bargain was a royal marriage for his daughter Alicent for Viserys' firstborn or himself later. Unfortunately, Viserys had no living sons, with them having died young, and only his daughter Rhaenyra by Aemma Arryn, so it seems likely that Otto was getting antsy if he was ever going to get paid back. Something made Viserys take the much younger Alicent as his bride after Aemma's death, and it's largely assumed that he did it to pay off his debt to Otto. But this sequence with Otto leading the party against Daemon, then Alicent walking up the aisle kissing Viserys on the cheek, and then cut to the dragon egg, may tell a different tale. Otto may have sealed the deal, so to speak, by carrying out that order and somehow convincing Daemon to hand over the stolen egg. And it's very surprising considering Otto himself is not a warrior. He's cut from the same cloth as Tywin Lannister, fighting wars by writing letters rather than leading armies personally. That Otto personally went to Dragonstone, confronted Daemon, and got the job done against the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms, and Daemon may have finally gotten the recently widowed King Viserys to agree to marry Alicent. You know, the things you can guess from approximately 30 seconds of footage, am I right? Next up is the swearing to King Viserys and Rhaenyra scenes, along with Rhaenys speaking to Rhaenyra. King Viserys had decided early on that when Rhaenyra was his only child, that he would name her his heir to the Iron Throne, a decision that, crucially, Otto Hightower also pushed for, but proved unpopular with some of his lords. As Rhaenys says to Rhaenyra,
Men would sooner put the realm to the torch and see a woman ascend the Iron Throne.
The main reason for this, aside from just misogyny, is that for most of Westeros at the time, excluding Dorne, which is actually not a part of the Seven Kingdoms, but kind of is, that's a future video, operated under a loose system of male preference primogeniture inheritance, meaning in a very, very simplified way, male heirs come before female heirs unless there are no males left, in which case a female can inherit a title. Many lords depended on this system of inheritance for not only their right to rule, but their self-image, and looked down on the quote-unquote weak Dornish who had equal gender inheritance. They feared that if a woman took the throne, they could possibly enforce changes they didn't want in inheritance kingdom-wide, and perhaps moving more towards equal inheritance structure and increased women's rights. And with an army of dragons at her back, Rhaenyra could do that and enforce it as she wished. Of course, there's no indication that Rhaenyra actually wanted to do that, but the lords feared the possibility and therefore prayed for a son for King Viserys. Hell hath no fury like powerful men scared of women. To add on to this, many of the lords had feared this exact possibility since Aegon's conquest, as the Targaryens and Valyrians did not necessarily believe that men are the natural rulers. Queen Visenya, Aegon's older sister wife, made the claim that since she was the oldest of the three siblings, that her son Maegor should be the heir to the Iron Throne over Aegon's firstborn Aenys. Rhaena Targaryen as well, older sister to Jaehaerys, believed that when Maegor was killed, she should have been monarch over her little brother Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys and Alicent also later clashed over this very question, when he disinherited his granddaughter Rhaenys in favor of her uncle Baelon, causing a pseudo-divorce between the sibling monarchs. So the question of the rules of inheritance for the Iron Throne in particular at this time were as changeable as flame, warping at the whims of the current monarchs, leading to many of their vassals having anxiety about if they one day be facing rebellions from their sisters and cousins emboldened by a Targaryen ruling queen. Or, you know, not just having total control of the women in their lives. A reality they felt they were about to face with Rhaenyra as queen. All of this to explain why King Viserys commanded his lords to come to King's Landing to swear fealty to himself and Rhaenyra as their future ruler. In this clip, we hear from Lord Rickon Stark, Lord Corlys Velaryon, and Lord Borman Baratheon, three of the most powerful lords in all of Westeros, bending their knee to the pleased princess. That this was necessary at-all to Viserys tells the tale starkly about how worried he was about his daughter actually having the support to take the Iron Throne after his death, especially since the other choice at the time was his wild younger brother Daemon, who clearly wanted the throne himself and had a habit of being uncontrollable and violent. A very real possibility was that Daemon could seize the crown for himself and kill or force his niece to marry him with Viserys dead. The Targaryens had conquered their 7 kingdoms a little more than a century earlier, and they had already faced one major civil war and several rebellions against their rule. It's not unreasonable to think that Rhaenyra's ascension to power might cause the same things to happen. The third sequence is, shockingly, primarily about Daemon again. Rename the show to House of Daemon. I dare you. This is the feast that we previously speculated about in the last teaser. In this one, they show more footage from it and gave more context to explain what's going on. This feast is in the Great Hall of King's Landing, featuring the Velaryons in their splendid clothes making a grand entrance. And now we can also see the white dress wearing Rhaenyra doing some kind of dance with her future husband Rhaenyra Velaryon. I'm guessing this is the feast announcing their betrothal, because if they were already married, I assume they would not be arriving separately. Although knowing their relationship, maybe they would. Not a lot of love there. The dancing between the two is very dragon-like. They appear to be spreading their arms like wings back to back. What's key about this, though, is not the dance in particular with Rhaenyra, but the look from her uncle Daemon at the end of the high table. Daemon looks at his teenage niece like a hungry wolf, and the eye lines of the edit make it look like Rhaenyra is meeting his gaze back appraisingly. Whether that's actually how the sequel will go in the show, the edit in the trailer makes you think they are making suggestive eye contact and possibly flirting. And that becomes important because of that thing I said earlier. Daemon viewed Rhaenyra as an obstacle or a path to the Iron Throne. Their story is told in Fire and Blood by the court fool Mushroom, who claims that Daemon managed to seduce his teenage niece. Although seduce is probably the wrong word, to be honest. Predate, victimize, choose your favorite term for abuse of minors. Septon Eustace claims that Daemon took Rhaenyra's virginity, but Mushroom goes even further and claims that Daemon was giving her sex lessons on how to please a man using himself as the test subject. Creepy. At the time, it's treated as a scandalous rumor, but given that Rhaenyra and Daemon later do marry after their spouses die in short succession, and Rhaenyra's public fondness for her uncle from a young age, those rumors perhaps have more foundation. Certainly, this quick exchange hints that way. This is not a normal look shared between an uncle and a niece. Whatever actually happened, Rhaenyra and Daemon were allegedly discovered by a member of the Kingsguard making the dragon with 2 backs. Viserys and Daemon argued, leading to Daemon being exiled. They say a look is worth 1,000 words, and that look proves that point. And there is, of course, a follow-up sequence to this where Daemon and Rhaenyra are clasping hands with what looks like blood spilling out between them while they stare into each other's eyes with smirks on their faces. Daemon and Rhaenyra do end up marrying in a secret ceremony that drives King Viserys absolutely bonkers. Given the body language and whatever Rhaenyra is wearing on her head, I would guess that's what we're seeing. There's also some kind of smear of blood on Daemon's forehead, which may be some long-forgotten Valyrian marriage ritual. The thing on Rhaenyra's head sort of looks like a dragon-shaped veil as well, making me think that yes, this is probably their marriage. Tying up that loose end from before, yeah, Daemon does groom his niece from a young age and ends up marrying her in what appears to be a cynical power grab for a man obsessed with wearing a crown. Although short in runtime, with just a little bit of background knowledge, you can see how they laid out that plot point for the audience pretty clearly. And there may be another scene connected to this as well. The scene where a short, silver-haired young man is thrown to the floor roughly by 2 members of the Kingsguard. At first, I was confused at who this might be, since we don't get a good look at their face, like maybe this is Aegon II. But after conferring with my Matt Smith face expert, I feel pretty confident that this is in fact Daemon being thrown to the floor. For the explanation, we go to Chloe Ketchum, co-host of Girls Gone Canon podcast. Take it away, Chloe.
Thank you so much for throwing it over to me, Dr. Professor Magician. Yes, in all of my years studying the morphology of Matt Smith's face bones, whether that is the chin bone, which is prominent and you could see it from space, or the brow bone, which has, surprise, no brows, this is most definitely Matt Smith, and I can confirm it's him falling. If you have seen Doctor Who, The Crown, or many of the other movies that Matt Smith has been in, or TV shows, I mean, listen, he's always getting thrown on the ground or beaten up by nemesis, or you name it. This is a very, very typical Matt Smith derping chin bone moment. And you know, of course, our Dr. Professor Matt the Magician, Joe Magician, is very handsome and wait a second, who Who wrote this?
Yes, thank you, Chloe, for that excellent analysis and those very genuine, not scripted by me compliments. Why it makes sense for this to be Daemon is the detail I mentioned earlier, that he was allegedly caught by a member of the Kingsguard doing the Dance of the Dragons with Rhaenyra. How many more euphemisms for sex involving dragons can I come up with? Take a shot every time I do. With the Kingsguard grabbing a short-haired Daemon and hurling him like a sack of potatoes, it makes sense if this scene is the aftermath of him being caught in bed with Rhaenyra, particularly after the feast. Next up, we've got this giant decrepit hall with what looks like hundreds of people inside and some sort of box being carried between them with urgency. As I said in my quick breakdown, this is a location we should be very familiar with, the ruined fortress of Harrenhal Hall in the Riverlands. Fans of Game of Thrones will remember it as that huge grim ruin that Arya was held at after being captured, and later waited on the unwitting Tywin Lannister as his cupbearer. Although this is a very new angle and location, previously we saw mostly passages, courtyards, and large rooms. This is instead the Great Hall of Harrenhal, the so-called Hall of 100 Hearths, although it only actually had 35. In what appears to be the Great Council of 101. The Great Council, called by the old King Jaehaerys I, was asking the lords of Westeros to choose his heir for him. The previously mentioned Rhaenys Targaryen and her children, Laenor and Laena, were next up in inheritance, but Jaehaerys was unhappy with that reality of recognizing a woman's right to the Iron Throne, hence Rhaenys' aggravation speaking to Rhaenyra, and so he called the council, seemingly hoping to get one of his other grandchildren, Viserys or Daemon, in line to inherit with the support of the Lords of Westeros. The box as well is very likely to be the actual ballot box used, as the Lords of Westeros had a vote for who should be the next king. It's a very complicated political and legal situation that I'll be exploring in a future video. In short though, Viserys ends up winning the vote, allowing Jaehaerys to disinherit Rhaenys and her children with Corlys Velaryon and name Viserys the next king of the Iron Throne. What's interesting here is actually getting to see at least some parts of the Great Council. I wouldn't be surprised if this is Rhaenys bitterly narrating the event to Rhaenyra. With Jaehaerys not featured in the show as far as we know, it seems uncertain if the Great Council, a key factor in the eventual civil war and explaining much of the rivalries within the Targaryen family, would show up at all except in passing references. Or it maybe would show up as a DVD extra like the History and Lore series Game of Thrones used to include. Although the framing of House of the Dragon will make it seem like it's kind of just a rivalry between Rhaenyra and Alicent that got out of hand and bloomed into violence, in truth the conflict between them had been simmering ever since Rhaenys was denied the throne, and the political deals Viserys seems to have made to secure the vote for himself. The two queens inherited 100 years of competing claims with unclear inheritance, while the Seven Kingdoms, which were previously independent, chafing under the rule of the Dragon Lords from across the sea, trying to enforce changes they didn't want. Speaking of Rhaenyra and Alicent's rivalry, let's talk about Alicent literally trying to stab Rhaenyra to death in front of the small council. We previously saw the lead up to this in the first teaser, with a furious Alicent drawing the infamous Targaryen dagger and crossing the room. We see here the conclusion that she is trying to drive it through Rhaenyra's face unsuccessfully. This one is a bit difficult to pinpoint when it would be exactly. Much of their murderous animosity came after the war starts in earnest and they are largely separated. But it could definitely be after Rhaenyra's sons by Harwin Strong fought Alicent's son Aemond and took out his eye in the scuffle. Alicent also appears to be going after Rhaenyra's eye, maybe trying to get some kind of eye for an eye revenge in that moment. More than literally when this happens, this along with the other scene of Rhaenyra and Alicent giving each other the evilest of eyes sets the tone that the two queens' hatred of each other is a primary factor in turning the simmering inheritance squabble into a full-on feud and eventually war. And there is no doubt that this is being enabled by Alicent's manipulative and ambitious father, Otto Hightower, the Tywin Lannister of this series. We can hear Otto speaking to Alicent here.
We play an ugly game. You have the determination to win it.
As I said, Alicent inherits a lot of baggage, and almost all of it comes from Otto, who had used his time as Hand of the King to try and permanently wed the Hightowers to the Targaryens in power, often pushing the envelope just a little bit too far. He once managed to get himself fired as Hand of the King for suggesting one too many times to King Viserys that he needed to disinherit Rhaenyra and instead name his oldest son by Alicent, Aegon Targaryen, Otto's grandson, as the new heir. Otto had also previously employed Alicent to serve as handmaiden and companion, not sure about that one, to the very old King Jaehaerys. seemingly trying to curry favor with the dying king to favor his family. And now with Viserys, Otto kept up the same pressure, using Alicent's beauty and charm to drive King Viserys away from his wife Aemma and then later daughter Rhaenyra, a strategy that did eventually work. When Viserys married the young Alicent, much like Tywin did with Cersei Lannister, Otto saw his daughter as a tool for statecraft and nurtured her into a weapon for his ambitions of capturing the Iron Throne. There's no doubt that Alicent and Rhaenyra did not like each other very much, but it feels for certain that whispered poison like Otto does here made the two young women act out the rivalry of their fathers and deepened their hatred. If you're looking for who you're going to hate most in the series, Otto Hightower is here, and he is the worst. The last few sequences have a lot less meaning to them, so we're just going to roll through these relatively quickly. First, the casket dropped into the water on the Velaryon home of Driftmark. A freeze frame on the carvings show us that this is most likely Laena Velaryon's funeral, Laena being Daemon's second wife to die on his path to Rhaenyra. It's an interesting detail that the Velaryons, famously sailors, traders, and perhaps sometimes pirates, chose to bury their dead at sea. The Targaryen custom is to burn their dead. I think most of us assume that all Valyrian houses would do the same. Apparently not. The Velaryons have their own unique burial practices, which I think is a pretty cool detail to differentiate them from the Targaryens. In much of the backstory and lore, the Velaryons are treated as basically Targaryens that wear turquoise instead of black and red. There's very, very little differentiating. This detail, though, shows that the showrunners are putting thought into making them feel like their own house with traditions and cultures that are separate from their close Valyrian relatives, giving them personality. Next, we see Kingsguard beating the ever-living crap out of someone, blood flying all over the place. There's no real telling who this could be or why they're doing it. It'd be interesting if it was Daemon, as he's already getting manhandled and opposed by the Kingsguard earlier in this teaser, but that's nothing really more than a guess. Kingsguard do awful things all the time on command, so this could really be anything. And last up for the sequences, we get Daemon taking the gold cloaks out into King's Landing for a joyous beating up of the peasantry. A little background here. Previously, King's Landing had a city watch, but it was disorganized thuggery that didn't do much other than drink and frequent the brothels. Daemon was given command of the city watch early in his life, an attempt by his brother Viserys to give Daemon a job where he seemingly could not cause much trouble. This massively backfired as Daemon reorganized the city watch into his personal army, giving them all distinctive gold cloaks. Daemon became known for using his several thousand strong, newly armed and lightly trained thugs to rule the undercity of King's Landing, giving him the twin nicknames the Prince of the City and Lord of Flea Bottom. While he commanded them, and for years afterwards, the Gold Cloaks beat the ever-living crap out of the populace of King's Landing and remained fiercely loyal to Daemon as he enabled all their worst behaviors and actually celebrated them. There's a definite feeling that while Viserys ruled the Red Keep and the Seven Kingdoms, Daemon ruled King's Landing. One thing I also want to discuss here, aside from the content, is the color grading of the teaser. This is a little bit off my normal commentary, I know, but stick with me. It'll be worth it. For those of you unaware, a color grade is kind of like a color filter that is applied to footage. You may be more familiar with the concept from social media, where filters change all the colors in a photo or video for a desired effect. The same is true for film. The color grade added to footage can often be just as important for establishing setting and mood of any particular scene as anything shown on the screen. For instance, Game of Thrones used 3 main color grades to establish their shots. Footage in the north, at the wall, and beyond the wall overwhelmingly were graded to a very dark blue, creating this gloomy, dark, melancholy feeling, but also making it instantly recognizable to the audience that even in an unfamiliar set, that the characters were still in the same general area of the north. One of the more infamous color grades in pop culture is the overwhelming yellow applied to Breaking Bad scenes that take place in Mexico or just sort of anywhere near the border. Viewers have learned over the years from popular shows and movies that particular locations, climates, or even time frames have a particular color grade to them in film, and it's often used as a visual shorthand. A scene that is graded to be particularly very orange, it's probably a flashback or in the past or meant to be nostalgic in some way. Green color grades are often meant to indicate that something is strange or off, maybe dreamlike or supernatural. The Matrix made great use of this. grading all the scenes within the Matrix itself green to make the viewer think something is wrong and off even before they learn the twist that, spoiler alert, Neo is in a machine simulation. As you may have noticed from most of these clips, this footage has been given a pretty strong yellow color grade and noticeably darkened. Many of the scenes are indoors or at night, but just as many during the day or outdoors, yet they all sort of look the same. The heavy yellow color grade is pervasive, darkening and flattening colors in costumes, sets, and even the outside world. As you can see here, the normally blue skies and water have a greenish tinge to them from the yellow grade. Scenes with lots of natural lighting look nearly the same as those in halls lit by candles. It does create a feeling of continuity throughout the teaser, that these are all meant to be in proximity to each other. As I said before, this is intentional. The similar harsh grading gives you the feeling that they are all related, that they're all kind of in the same place, in the same way that the deep blues from Game of Thrones would let you know that everything's sort of near the wall. It naturally leads to your mind finding connections between the scenes, looking for similar objects, places, and people as your mind assumes they all should be related. This is something that Game of Thrones has trained you well to look for unconsciously, and House of the Dragon is exploiting that expectation. The grade becomes especially obvious when you compare footage from similar locations in Game of Thrones to this House of the Dragon teaser. For instance, the Red Keep is no longer red, rather an orangey tan as a result of the grade. Also here, if you compare the costumes from set leaks on the beaches in England, we can see that the wigs the characters are wearing are actually pure white, and yet in the footage they have this sort of yellowy color to them, like they are perhaps a golden doodle who got a little wet. The consistent grade though is broken for two sequences, and again I think that's very likely intentional. The first is the Great Council at Harrenhal, which is abandoned the yellow, is instead an almost northern dark blue. This tells you visually two things: that this is a very different location, and that it is incongruous with the rest of the teaser, that there's something you should be paying attention to here. Can you perhaps spot it? Yes, that's Harrenhal. Oh wait, it's in the Riverlands, and oh, look at all these people, this must be important. Oh, it's the Great Council. Bingo, you got it. Color grade doing its job. The other sequence given a blue grade is the possible marriage scene between Daemon and Rhaenyra. This stands out as not being a shift in location, but it's a shift in meaning for the viewer. Marriages are normally happy, right? Joyous events, people doing the chicken dance and trying to remember the dance for Gangnam Style, hitting the open bar, all that good stuff. Bright whites and the sun beaming down on happy location full of flowers. And yet, this sequence is given a very dark blue grade, the same kind that Game of Thrones would use for the White Walkers and their attacks on the Night's Watch. The feeling that it's in darkness or under a thick bank of smoke and clouds, gloomy, dark, dangerous, melancholy, kind of a lingering sense of doom. This is great color grading choice here, because not only does it draw attention from the rest of the teaser footage, but it creates for the viewer the idea that despite their smiles on their faces, that something grim is happening, a doomed omen for Westeros as the uncle and niece tie the knot, which of course matches what we know about this in the books. Daemon and Rhaenyra marry in secret, in defiance of Viserys, and their marriage scares Otto Hightower and Alicent into believing that not only could Rhaenyra threaten their power structures and positions at court, but with Daemon as king consort, he could very well kill them and destroy their house root and stem with little consequence. He could kill Rhaenyra's rivals, including her half-siblings, Otto Hightower's grandchildren, and use the gold cloaks to toss them all into the black cells, maybe even burn the Hightower to the ground with Caraxes. It's a marriage that, despite the look on their faces, doesn't promise many happy returns, but instead pounds the drums of war even louder. And the color grade is doing a lot of work to tell you that. The overwhelming use of the yellow color grade also does more work in setting the mood of the world we're about to jump into. Game of Thrones gave King's Landing previously a very light yellow color grade, mostly just muting the bright Mediterranean colors of Dubrovnik and Croatia where the footage was shot. The skies look blue, the buildings and skin and hair still look like their normal colors. Those white cloaks of the Kingsguard are pretty close to pure white. It's a very natural, light looking color grade, and it makes King's Landing and all the different locations feel like a home base for the viewer, or normal. The further you get away from King's Landing, the more the color grade gets extreme. More blues and greens as you head north and west, and the yellows get much more intense to the east and to the south. The yellows to the east and the south is a definite peculiarity of Hollywood, as I talked about earlier, where for some reason, They have decided that places that are hotter and more exotic feeling and perceived incorrectly by audiences to be more dangerous and foreign become more yellow. That's the point of the examples of Breaking Bad turning Mexico a flat yellow. Similar grades are applied in films like Slumdog Millionaire, Sicario, and Extraction, all using the same principles that yellow means equatorial and dangerous. It's a pervasive practice that is drawing criticism from the people who live in those places for creating biased understandings, and Game of Thrones is no stranger to this. The most yellow grades in the original show are in Essos, Karth, Meereen, Vaes Dothrak. They all share this feature, yet that's not what's being done here in the teaser. Yellows being draped on the most of the footage is not being used for relative locations or climate, but tone and mood. Everything is yellow and dark, visually reminding the viewers that despite what you may see, everything is dangerous and tense on the brink of war. There will be no jokes or fun times. This is serious business and a world on the edge of war. Season 8 used this effect as well, with King's Landing's natural lighting becoming noticeably more yellow when Dany's forces marched on the city, and then plunging into blues and gloom after her attack on the populace, visually creating the idea that another long night has fallen. The use of color in this teaser is very interesting in that way, showing that the filmmakers are using color more than just indicating general locations, but instead using it as an element of storytelling, adapting to mood, and showing moments to pay attention to for how they visually stand out. Although, to be honest, I hope this is just for the teaser trailer. If the entire thing is shot in dark yellows and muted colors, it will get old fast and lose basically all meaning. In fairness though, it is not unusual for promotional material like this to apply their own color grades to achieve a specific purpose that is not shared by the actual show or movie. So, let's wrap up this ridiculous amount of effort for what amounts to a very small amount of footage. First, there's a ridiculous amount of attention being given to Daemon in this trailer. He seemingly is moving the plots all on his own, like a no eyebrow having agent of chaos. It asks the question, would there even be a dance if Daemon had just taken up a hobby? Like if Daemon invents and plays golf, perhaps Westeros is totally fine. Mark that down for a good fan fiction. And that's a question that HBO wants you to ask about the chaotic, ambitious asshole that you may come to love and hate at the same time. Daemon is one of George's favorite characters to write for these exact reasons. Many make the comparison between Kristen Cole and Jaime Lannister, both being Kingsguard who had large impacts on history, and that's not wrong. But in my opinion, Jaime and Daemon are much closer in the roles they play within the stories being told. They do terrible, selfish, immoral things, also have characteristic and actions you can find merit in. A typical of Martin Gray character that challenges your sensibilities about who you should like in a show and why. Going off that, the content of the teaser is fairly easy to follow with even a little bit of knowledge of what happens in Fire and Blood. Sometimes I watch these sort of things and I need to open up a Song of Ice and Fire search or my copy of the book or open the wikis and try and piece together what I just saw, even going back to Game of Thrones. This teaser, I didn't have to do anything like that. There are clear, specific references to plot points from Fire and Blood, and if you're the sort of person that very, very much needs the source material to match the adaptation closely, that's pretty good news. What we're seeing so far is straight from Fire and Blood in precise detail, despite the short runtime of what we're being shown. I am, though, moderately worried about the tone of the teaser itself combined with the color grading. This show may have an overly grim and serious cast of unlikable characters, at least based on this. Something more like a Zack Snyder film or one of the DC films, or the later seasons of Game of Thrones. Hey guys, editing Joe here. Turns out I was totally right when I was writing the script and I didn't know it. The cinematographer for House of the Dragon is named Fabian Wagner, whose previous projects include Game of Thrones for 9 episodes, including The Long Night and the Battle of the Bastards, as well as, wait for it, Zack Snyder's Justice League. Feels good to be right. Where most of the characters' sense of fun and humor died except in short bursts, withering under the seriousness of the wars. We may have a series that starts at that tone and then never leaves. All fire and blood, but missing the beating heart of it. There needs to be characters and relationships that feel good, something to feel that has been lost in the chaos of wars and betrayals happening. George likes to say that A Song of Ice and Fire will end feeling bittersweet, but it can't just be all bitter. There does need to be sweet too. Hopefully we'll get that too in the series itself. Although, maybe I am reading way too far into it. I mean, just a teaser, right?